Good morning. Got time to begin our Bible class this morning. Got quite a bit of material to jump into, so like to offer a word of prayer, and then we sort of just jump right into our study this morning. Let us pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for this beautiful day you blessed us with. Father, grateful for this Lord's Day and the opportunity we have to assemble together, Father, and thankful for this Bible class hour. We can open your word together, Father, and we can study from it. And pray we'll always be good stewards of your word, Father, and pray your blessings as we study your word this morning, and we can study with open minds and open hearts, and pray for your blessings upon us as we go into the Bible, the worship hour here shortly, Father, and pray that everything we do during that time will be done in spirit and in truth in a way that's pleasing in your sight, Father. Pray for your forgiveness for our sins, and pray for your continued blessings upon this congregation and everyone here, Father, and those that we're mindful of and need prayers on their behalf. And again, just pray you'll go with us in everything we do. Forgive us for our sins. In Jesus' name, amen. So we're going to pick back up in Matthew chapter 24. We'll have just a very brief review of last week, just kind of so remind ourselves where we are, where we finished in last week. So last week we made it through verse 22, Matthew 24, verse 22. We talked about the Great Tribulation that Jesus mentions in verse 21, and we talked about how this Great Tribulation that Jesus mentions is not the same as the Great Tribulation in the premillennial view, but instead it's the time, the period immediately preceding the destruction of Jerusalem. We looked at the context there in Matthew 24, and even some secular history around Jerusalem. We can see how all that fits pretty well with basically with what Jesus tells us in the context. This tribulation starts with the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place, and then ultimately ends with brings us up to the destruction of Jerusalem itself. So what we saw, a few weeks back, we looked at Cestius, his attack on Jerusalem, how this fit the description of the abomination of desolation. So when he attacked Jerusalem in 66 A.D., he retreated from the city before he took it. This allowed opportunity for the Christians to flee. And then Vespasian picks up the siege again with the War of the Jews in 68 A.D. He comes to take Jerusalem and then becomes emperor. So he goes to Rome, but Rome still has fortified the city, so basically nobody can come in or out. And we saw that how the decline of conditions in Jerusalem was significant. Hundreds of thousands of people died, and then the tribulation was ended in AD 70 when Titus, who was Vespasian's son, came back to destroy the city. So that's sort of the gist of where we landed in verse 22. We'll pick up this morning in verse 23. We'll see Jesus give another warning against false Christ. I think there's one thing that we need to understand. It's tremendously important as we go through this chapter. It's important, obviously, through any Bible study, biblical study. We need to understand the context. We need to understand what's being talked about. But I think specifically in Matthew 24, there's a lot of commentators, a lot of people that will say that Jesus more or less changes subjects a couple times. If you remember back, Jesus is responding to the disciples' questions about when will these things happen, these things being the destruction of the temple and then Jesus' second coming. So our outline, and we'll look at here in a few minutes, but we've looked at it several times throughout the study, is that I'm maintaining the position that Jesus continues on subject of the destruction of Jerusalem all the way through about verse 34, verse 35, and then he transitions subjects to his second coming. And we'll look at this more in a little bit of detail as we go through, but the idea is that we need to understand, it's important to be able to understand when is Jesus changing subjects, when is he making a transition of subject, because the premillennial view is that there's some verses that we're saying is describing the destruction of Jerusalem that the premillennialists will say is talking about his second coming. So in order for it to talk about his second coming, it means that he's changing subjects a couple times back and forth which in my mind is a little bit more confusing than if Jesus answered their question sort of, logically in the way that they asked. And I think that the context, we need to understand the context, but also we've laid out these couple of guidelines we mentioned several times for biblical interpretation. Number one, God is not the author of confusion. So if something seems confusing in the context, in my mind, it's probably because we're not necessarily understanding what's being said. It's not that God has purposely put something there that is confusing to understand. Now, obviously, some passages are more hard or more difficult to understand than others. But I think as a general principle, God is not the author of confusion. He's not going to use a sign or a symbol or something in one place and then change it in another place without telling you that He's going to do it. And we can see that because the Bible is its own best commentary. So we need to let the Bible interpret itself first before we start relying on, men's opinions and different things like that can lead us astray. So the idea is that we approach the Bible with the understanding that God has given us all things that pertain to life and godliness, and that we can let the Bible interpret itself. Then I think we can best understand when Jesus transitions subjects and understand the context. But again, our study through this study through Matthew 24 is to try to determine what's the true meaning of Matthew 24. We're not necessarily refuting premillennialism or any of the other doctrines that don't fit the context here, but instead we're just trying to lay out, what is the Bible actually, what is Matthew 24 actually saying? If we understand that, then we don't need to refute anything else if we just understand what the Bible's saying. But so that's the main reason that I continue to put the outline on the slides every week, and we continue to see where we are, because it helps us understand has there been a transition in subject or not, and so then when the subject is transitioned, we'll be able to see it. But remember, there's Jesus' teaching here is in response to the two questions that the disciples asked him. Basically, when is these things going to happen? The destruction of the temple, and when is your second coming going to be? So he starts out answering around the destruction of the temple, which is also the destruction of Jerusalem. So our outline again points to this, where we see verses all the way down to verse 34. Jesus is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. Then he does transition subjects in verse 35, and then verse 36 he picks up talking about his second coming, and we'll see that as we go through. But I just want to point out sort of the the importance of understanding the transition of subjects in probably, I think, in this chapter especially. And then in the section of the predictions concerning the destruction of Jerusalem, I think we can break it down into 5 more sections. So we've been in section 3, predictions of the Great Tribulation. This goes through verse 28. So we'll finish this section this morning, and we'll hopefully pick up in verse 29. But as we do this, as we go through this, some verses are going to be more confusing at first. I think we can see that at first glance. Some of these verses are more confusing than others, but I think we'll show beyond a reasonable doubt as we deal with it that our outline fits the context and fits how Jesus is dealing with the two questions. So with that, let's start with Matthew chapter 24. We'll read verses 23 through 28. And if any man shall say unto you, Lo, here is Christ, or there, believe it not. For there shall arise false Christs and false prophets, and shall show great signs and wonders, insomuch that, if it were possible, they shall deceive the very elect. Behold, I have told you before. Wherefore, if they shall say unto you, Behold, he is in the desert, go not forth. Behold, he is in the secret chambers, believe it not. For as the lightning cometh out of the east, and shineth even unto the west, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. For wheresoever the carcass is, there will the eagles be gathered together. So, we've already seen Jesus warn his disciples multiple times in this chapter about false Christs and false prophets. More or less every section that we've got our outline divided into, there's at least one verse or two that Jesus warns them against false prophets. So here we have Jesus again giving more or less another warning, or maybe a final warning in relation to the destruction of Jerusalem for the false prophets that are going to be coming. He seems to be a little maybe more, it's a little bit the same, but I think it's a little bit different too. Here, I think you can almost hear Christ pleading, "Please do not be deceived by these false Christs. They're going to come." But he's almost pleading with them, "Do not be deceived by them." And he gives some irrefutable proof to show how you'll be able to pick these people out. But he mentions that, I think, again, it's imagine all the things that's going to be going on during this time. He mentions that the false prophets are going to be so convincing that that it could be impossible for them to deceive the very elect. So the word elect here, I think it's important for us to understand that. It means picked out, chosen to obtain salvation through Christ. Hence, Christians are called the chosen or elect of God. But this is not a reference to the word elect that, as Calvinism refers to elect. So this is not that God has individually elected any one of us in order to be saved. That's not what the word is. That's not what the word means. Ephesians 1 verse 4, God, He planned salvation, the plan of salvation through Christ since the foundation of the world. Ephesians 1 verse 4. But the plan was not for that He individually elects any one of us to be saved. The plan was that we could all be elected, or we could all be saved through Christ. So that was the plan. It's not that He picked us individually, but He picked. The plan was salvation is in Christ, and that was a plan that He, had laid out since the foundation of the world. So Calvinism would say that we're elected or chosen individually, but that's not the case. So when Jesus says the elect, He's talking about the saved, the Christians or His disciples. Any of those words would probably fit the definition, but basically those that are saved, those that are Christians, is what He's talking about when He says the word elect. But again, Jesus is telling them that the false prophets would be so convincing that they could even deceive those that have obeyed the gospel. So those that have an understanding of Christ, those that have come to knowledge of the truth and obeyed the gospel, could even be deceived by these false prophets. So He's pleading with them not to be deceived by them. If we go back to the disciples' questions to Jesus at the beginning of the chapter, we can see that they associated the destruction of the temple with the end of the world. And we won't take the time to look at that in detail this morning, but we know that there's several passages throughout the New Testament and the Gospels, first chapter or so of Acts, that we see that even the apostles believed in an earthly kingdom of Jesus. And so obviously when Jesus tells them that the temple is going to be destroyed, they associated that event with the end of the world. So to them it appeared as two things of the same event, which would be the end of the world. And Jesus knows this, and obviously their thinking would be corrected later on, especially when the apostles received the Holy Spirit. But He knows that their thinking is maybe a little bit skewed on this, and you can see that how it's skewed even in the questions, the way they ask the questions. So I think that's why Jesus is answering their questions in the way that He is as we go through chapter 24. But the fact remains that there would be those false prophets, those that would come, that would show these signs and could deceive people. So it was possible for even the followers of Christ to be tempted, especially in these times of great tribulation. You think about they're fleeing from Jerusalem. The Roman army is coming to destroy the city. They've left Jerusalem. They flee to the mountains. All that would be, and especially if you have the view that this is associated with Jesus' second coming, and now somebody comes to you and says, "Hey, Jesus has come back. He's in the desert. Let's go look for Him." It could potentially be easier for you to be deceived by somebody because it's something that you're potentially looking for to begin with. But I think because of this, Jesus answers their questions this is one of the reasons that Jesus answers their questions in the way that He does. But He also gives them some irrefutable proof here in this context to differentiate between the real Christ and the false Christ that are going to be coming. Verse 26, He reminds them not to believe those who say that Christ is coming in some secret chamber or out in the desert, which is sort of similar to what He's warned about in the past. So, I don't think anybody's going to live in the desert. Generally, people don't live in the desert. Maybe you live around the desert, or maybe you travel through the desert. But generally, the people don't live out in the middle of the desert. So, it's reasonable to assume that if you're saying Christ is in the desert, that we're going to have to go find him. He's not appearing. You're not saying that he's appearing amongst people. He's appearing some far out, some way, someplace far out in the desert. The same way with if it's a secret chamber, it's somewhere in secret. It's not in the open. So these are false Christs that are coming saying that Jesus is coming back, but he's coming back in some kind of hidden manner, some kind of secret manner. He's not coming back openly. But then he tells them in verse 27, that we don't need to believe these false Christs when they say that Christ is coming in secret, because when Christ comes back, his second coming is going to be anything but a secret. Jesus tells them, when I come back, I'm not coming back in secret. When I come back, everybody's going to see me. It's going to be openly. It's going to be in the open. It's not going to be in the secret. He says, as the lightning cometh out of the east and shineth even unto the west, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. So you think about that. We got thunderstorms, tornadoes, and all things that come our way, and we see that big flash of lightning that just lights up the sky. Turns the night into day. Obviously, that's not a secret thing. I can see the lightning. I can see that lightning in my house, and maybe you live several miles away from me, and you could see the same lightning, right? Because it's almost goes. The lightning seems like it goes all the way from east to west. So Jesus is telling them, this is how you know that these people are false Christs, because they're telling you that Christ has come back, but you didn't see him come back. He's somewhere secret, and you need to go find him. He says, when I come back, I'm not going to come back in secret. I'm going to come back just as the lightning cracks across the sky. Everybody's going to see me. So again, it would be tempting, I guess. You can see how people could fall victim to those that, especially they're showing great signs and wonders. But Jesus has given them irrefutable proof of how to distinguish between the real second coming and these false prophets. But I think verse 27, again, we were talking about the transition of subjects earlier. Verse 27 is a good example of this, and it's important for us to understand the subject in verse 27, especially in the context of what's being talked about, and try to understand, did Jesus transition subjects? So did Jesus change the subject in verse 27, from talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, and specifically the false prophets that would come during the destruction of Jerusalem? Did he change subject from that, and did he start talking about his second coming? Well, a lot of people would say yes, he did, but I would say no, he didn't, because even though he's making a reference to his second coming in verse 27, no doubt about that. He's referencing his second coming in verse 27. But the whole point of the reference to his second coming in verse 27 is to show how sharp the contrast is between the false Christ and the real Christ. So Jesus is not changing subjects here and now. He's talking about his second coming. We'll see how verse 28 does not apply to his second coming. But he's not changing subjects. And there are some that will just say, well, verse 27 is talking about his second coming. Verse 28 is talking about destruction of Jerusalem. Verses 29 through 31 are talking about his second coming. So if that's the case, then you end up with Jesus jumping subjects back and forth. And I don't think that makes a lot of sense in the context. But also, I don't think it fits the context of verse 27 is changing the subject to his second coming. Again, he's referencing his second coming, but only because he's making a point and a sharp contrast between what his second coming is going to look like, so that you'll be able to distinguish between the false Christs that are saying Jesus is coming back. So it's important for us to understand that what the topic of discussion is as we go through chapter 24, so we can continue to understand, rightly divide the word. But I think that's incredibly important. It's something maybe we sort of overlook. But if we look at the context, what is Jesus talking about? In this context, just say starting in verse 23, and as he's going down, he's talking about the false Christs that are coming. during the period of the Great Tribulation, and obviously that wouldn't apply to His second coming. It applies to something different. But again, Jesus has not left the subject here. He's still talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. So I think we can notice the little word "for" here in verse 27. It says, "For as the lightning cometh out of the east." So the word "for" there is a conjunction. Obviously, it's joining what he's saying now to what he said before. What he just said before was, don't believe these people when they go out in the desert, or don't believe these people when they say go to the secret chambers. Believe it not. Don't follow them to the desert. Don't follow them to the secret chambers. For as the lightning cometh out of the east and shineth even unto the west, so shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. So this little word "for," three-letter word "for," ties verse 27 into verse 26 and the rest of the context, because 26 is part of what he's saying all along. So again, it's important to understand the transition of context, and I hope I'm not beating on this too much, but it's important to understand the subject that's being discussed, and so we can know how to distinguish when Jesus changes the subject on us. But Jesus gives them irrefutable proof here in verse 27 how to distinguish between the false Christ and the real Christ's second coming. So verse 28 is an interesting verse. It's a little bit, it's confusing, at first glance too as well. Verse 27, I think, can be confusing in the context until you can kind of put it all in perspective. But verse 28, "For wheresoever the carcass is, there will the eagles be gathered together." So there's a lot of disagreement and a lot of discussion on verse 28 and what it's referring to. So some argue that this verse is a reference to the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans, because the Romans carried the ensigns of eagles on their flags and on all their symbols and ensigns, and they actually put up these ensigns in the temple. As they were destroying the city, when the city was more or less destroyed on fire, the temple was being destroyed. They set these ensigns up in the temple and offered sacrifices to them in the temple. So obviously that's you can see sort of a correlation there. But again, I don't think it seems logical in the context that Jesus has changed in talking about the destruction of Jerusalem just yet. So our outline, again, will show that he picks up talking about the actual destruction of Jerusalem in verse 29 through 31, and 23 through 28 is still talking about the Great Tribulation. So Jesus is still talking about the period of the Great Tribulation. He hasn't transitioned subjects here to the destruction of Jerusalem until verse 29. But some commentators will argue over the use of the word eagle. Some say it's this is actually a reference to vultures instead of eagles, since it talks about there being a carcass there and the eagles gather together. Since eagles are generally predatory animals and they don't feed on dead carcasses like a vulture or something would. Some people argue over that. What should the interpretation there be of the word eagle? But Jesus makes a similar reference to this in Luke chapter 17 in sort of a different context, but the verses are almost the same. It says in verse 24, Luke 17, "For as the lightning that lighteneth out of the one part under heaven shineth unto the other part under heaven, so shall also the Son of Man be in his day." And in verse 37, "And they answered and said unto him, Where, Lord? And he said unto them, Wheresoever the body is, thither will the eagles be gathered together." So I think the actual meaning of verse 28 is very simple. It's easy for us to get bogged down into the details. Again, this context is difficult. There is several difficult verses to understand. But I think ultimately the true interpretation of verse 28 is pretty simple. Regardless of whether the interpretation of eagles needs to be eagles or vultures or whatever, the idea that we see here is that there's a dead animal, but we don't see the dead animal, but it's there, right? You don't see the dead animal, but the dead animal is there because you see the bird up in the sky circling around the animal seeking its prey. So, this is not done in secret. So even though you can't see the animal, you know it's there because the bird is circling, stalking its prey out in the open. It's obvious to you that that the animal is there, even without physically seeing the animal, because the bird circling its prey, stalking its prey, is the indication to us, or an indication to them, that the dead animal is there, that the carcass is there. So I think this is talking about, again, sort of Jesus' second coming is going to be the same way. He's laying out, again, another reason not to believe these false prophets. You will not have to seek Jesus at His second coming. It will not be in secret. It will not be hidden. It will be obvious. Just like it's obvious that there's a dead carcass somewhere, because you see the bird circling in the air. It's obvious that there's a dead carcass. You see the sign of a dead carcass by seeing the bird circle in the air. When Jesus comes back, it's not something that we're going to have to guess at. It's not something that's going to be hidden. It's going to be obvious that He's coming back, because He's going to show Himself as the lightning comes out of the east and the west, like He said. So I think verse 28 is Jesus again further assuring His disciples to not be deceived by these false prophets, because regardless of what signs they show, regardless of what they say, how they try to deceive people, the number one sign, the number one indication that Jesus is coming back, that He's truly coming back, is going to be that it's going to be open. It's not going to be hidden. You won't have to seek Jesus when He comes back. Everybody's going to see Him. It's going to be obvious. So I think that's what He's saying in verse 28. But I do think you could probably make a dual application here, verse 28, that still remains solidly in the context of what Jesus is talking about. So again, He's talking about the false prophets deceiving those. He's saying that they could be so deceptive they could even deceive the elect, those that are saved. So those undergoing or observing the Great Tribulation could potentially be easy targets for false prophets, you think. Somebody that's these difficult, trying times. Somebody, as Christians, are fleeing Jerusalem. They're fleeing the destruction there from the Roman army. Jesus tells them these are going to be troublesome times. These could potentially be easy targets for false prophets to deceive, especially if the elect, or as we already mentioned, still has it in their mind that the destruction of the temple is related to Jesus' second coming. If they already think that the destruction of the temple is just one part of the end of the world in Jesus' second coming, then it could be really easy for somebody to deceive them that Jesus is coming back. But in that case, the elect could be viewed as prey for the false prophets, who would be the predators. These predators, these false prophets, are preying on the elect, much like a wolf in sheep's clothing sort of thing. So in this manner, Jesus' words would again be another warning against the false prophets during the tribulation period as an opportunity to deceive people. And Josephus mentioned something similar to this when Jerusalem is being destroyed. He says, in these days there are many prophets suborned by the warlords to work on the people with promises that God's help was coming and that they should wait for it. This was to reduce the number of desertions and encourage hope in those so far immune to the threat of policing. Men are easily persuaded in adversity, and when the charlatan goes on to present a picture of release from the prevailing horrors, the sufferer becomes a complete slave to hope. So I think that fits with what Jesus is warning against, that when you're in a time of trouble, of incredible tribulation, and somebody comes and shows signs and wonders and promises that He can deliver you from this tribulation, from all these troubles, it could be easy to be deceived simply because of the hope that you want to be delivered from this, right? So I think that's again partly what Jesus is warning against. Don't be deceived by these people. Listen to me, listen to my words, and know the truth, and don't be deceived by these false prophets. But either way, I think the simple explanation of verse 28 is Jesus giving a warning about being deceived against the false prophets. It's an indication of how do you distinguish between a false prophet saying Jesus is coming and Jesus' real second coming. The false prophets say it's going to be in secret. Jesus is telling them it's going to be open. It's not going to be in secret. So that really concludes, that's through verse 28, so that concludes our section on the predictions of the Great Tribulation. So I want to go ahead and pick up directly into the next section, which is the predictions immediately following the Great Tribulation, which is the destruction of Jerusalem itself. There's only 3 verses. Again, these are some of the more difficult verses to understand in this chapter, and also some that's taken out of context by a lot of the religious world and used to support other doctrines. So I think it's important, incredibly important for us to understand these 3 verses. So I'd like to sort of introduce them, show how that these 3 verses are talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. We can show that aspect of it, and not talking about Jesus' second coming. Then the next week we can come back and go through these in detail. But again, remember our guidelines for interpretation. God is not the author of confusion. So first we have to remember that for something that's confusing to us in the Bible, maybe we need to step back and instead of relying on just going straight to man's interpretation, we should allow the Bible to interpret itself first. The Bible is its own best commentary. So these are the 2 sort of guidelines that we use for interpreting biblical prophecy and biblical interpretation. So jumping into verses 29 through 30, immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. And then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he shall send his angels with a great trumpet, with the great sound of a trumpet, and they shall gather together his elect from the 4 winds, from one end of heaven to the other. So, again, right off the bat, I think it's easy to see why this is a confusing context, especially if I say this is not talking about Jesus' second coming. We see things like the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. His angels are sounding the trumpet. That sounds a lot like a lot of the context we hear of Jesus' second coming, right? So if I say this is not applying to His second coming, this is applying to the destruction of Jerusalem, then we have to understand, how do I make this argument, right? So he says that, again, He's going to be coming in the clouds, sign of the Son of Man in heaven. How do we explain this? If you remember that verse 34, that Jesus says that this generation shall not pass till all these things shall be fulfilled, right? We haven't got to verse 34 yet, but Jesus tells His disciples, verse 34, this generation shall not pass till all these things shall be fulfilled. If you go all the way back to the beginning of the chapter, verse 3, when the disciples asked Him the questions, and it says, and as He sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came unto Him privately, saying, tell us, when shall these things be? And what shall be the sign of Thy coming and of the end of the world? So these things that the disciples are representing is Jesus' statement that the temple is going to be destroyed. He tells them no stone is going to be left upon another. So He tells them, as they're standing looking at the temple, they go to show Him the temple, and He says, not one stone is going to be left upon another. And this obviously confused the disciples. They come to Him later, says they come to Him privately, and they say, when shall these things be? Well, then notice they associated these things, the destruction of the temple, with the coming of the end of the world, Jesus' second coming and the end of the world. They thought it was two events of the same occurrence. All the way down to verse 34. So from verse 3 all the way to verse 34, Jesus tells them, this generation shall not pass till all these things shall be fulfilled. So these things have to be the same these things that the disciples asked Him in verse number 3. And so everything from verse 3 to verse 34 has to be applying to the same these things. Jesus is answering their questions, right? So, and we'll see as we move past 34, verse 34, He answers the second question. But He answers it a lot differently because He's talking about His second coming. So that's the first proof I think we have, is that Jesus is still talking about the destruction of Jerusalem in verses 29 through 31, because as far as I know, there's nobody that's still living that was in the generation standing there that Jesus was talking to. If there are, we've got some 2,000-something-year-old people still living today. But the fact is, those people did not live past their generation, and so what Jesus is talking about had to occur within the generation of the people living at that time. So there are many wordsmiths. You look in the literature, and scholars, different commentators, there's a lot of wordsmiths that will take the word generation and they'll try to bend that word to make it fit something like the doctrine of premillennialism or some interpretations they have in Matthew chapter 24 that doesn't fit, that that they know doesn't fit within the lifetime of the people Jesus is talking to. And so they'll take the word generation and they'll try to explain it in a plethora of different ways to make it mean something other than what it obviously means in the context. But the word generation here means that the definition of generation here is the whole multitude of men living at the same time. My generation is the whole multitude of men living at the same time that I'm living. That's what it means. And if you look at the Greek word that was used, there's nothing in the definition of that word that can mean anything other than the generation, a little generation in the way that we would take a generation today. It span everybody living at this point in time. So, again, that doesn't fit the context. What Jesus is saying is everything that He said, basically from verse 3 to verse 34, is going to happen in the lifetime of the people standing here today. So what does all this mean? Well, we can first notice that Jesus is using apocalyptic language in verses 29 through 31. Talks about, we see all these signs happening, and He's coming. The Son of Man is coming in the clouds. There's a lot of apocalyptic language in these three verses. It's common, if you look at the Bible, especially the Old Testament, it's common for God to use apocalyptic language when He pronounces judgment upon a nation. And I've got 8 examples. We won't look at all 8 this morning, but I've got 8 examples of when God has pronounced judgment upon a nation and used similar language. So here, Matthew 24, this apocalyptic language is used to refer to God's judgment upon the Jews, which was executed by the Roman Empire with the destruction of Jerusalem AD 70. So, again, this morning I just want to introduce these 3 verses. We'll kind of talk about, show how this applies to the destruction of Jerusalem and not Jesus' second coming. And then next week we'll look at these in more detail. But here's several examples of apocalyptic language used in the Old Testament when God is pronouncing judgment upon nations. He pronounced judgment on Babylon in Isaiah chapter 13, starting verse 10, "For the stars of heaven and the constellations thereof shall not give their light. The sun shall be darkened in his going forth, and the moon shall not cause her light to shine. Therefore I will shake the heavens, and the earth shall remove out of her place in the wrath of the Lord of hosts and in the day of His fierce anger." Isaiah 34, He pronounces judgment on Edom. And He says in verse 4 through 6, "And all the hosts of heaven shall be dissolved, and the heavens shall be rolled together as a scroll. And all their hosts shall fall down as the leaf falleth off from the vine, and as a falling fig from the fig tree. And for my sword shall be bathed in heaven. Behold, it shall come down upon Idumea, and upon the people of my curse to judgment. The sword of the Lord is filled with blood. It is made fat with fatness, and with the blood of rams, with the blood of lambs and goats, with the fat of the kidneys of the rams. For the Lord hath a sacrifice in Bozrah, and a great slaughter in the land of Idumea." Jeremiah 4, God pronounces judgment on Judah. Remember, we looked at this in our study in Jeremiah a while back. God pronounces judgment on Judah, the nation of Judah. He says, I beheld the earth, and lo, it was without form and void, and the heavens, and they had no light. I beheld the mountains, and lo, they trembled, and all the hills moved lightly. I beheld, and lo, there was no man, and all the birds of heaven were fled. I beheld, and lo, the fruitful place was a wilderness, and all the cities thereof were broken down at the presence of the Lord and by His fierce anger. And thus hath the Lord said, The whole land shall be desolate, yet will I not make a full end. For this shall the earth mourn, and the heavens above be black, because I have spoken it, I have purposed it, and will not repent, neither will I turn back from it. In Ezekiel 32, God pronounces judgment on Egypt. He says, when I shall put thee out, I will cover the heaven and make the stars thereof dark. I will cover the sun with a cloud, and the moon shall not give her light. all the bright lights of heaven will I make dark over thee, and set darkness upon thy land, saith the Lord God. Here's 4 other examples. We won't take the time to read them, but it's similar language. When you see God pronounce judgment upon these nations here, it talks about, the sun's going to be darkened, or the moon's going to be darkened, or these things are going to happen, and the heavens are going to melt, or whatever the case is. But the point that we're trying to make is that it's common in the Bible for God to use apocalyptic type language when He brings judgment upon His people, or when He pronounces judgment upon these people. And the purpose is to shows the significance of the event, right? I mean, it's something that if you weren't there, potentially, without the account of Josephus, for example, we would have no understanding of how severe the destruction of Jerusalem was. But because we have his writings preserved, we see how horrible the destruction of Jerusalem was, the tribulation that was there. But God's use of the apocalyptic language sort of shows the significance of it, right? We know it's something that's great. It's not just something that happened. It shows the significance of the event. So notice verse 22, he mentions the sign of the Son of Man in heaven. So what does this mean? The sign of the Son of Man. How does this refer to something other than Jesus' second coming? It's important for us to distinguish here that heaven, as mentioned in verse 30, heaven is the location of the Son of Man and not the location of the sign. So some modern translations put it differently, but both the King James, the American Standard, they both say, "Then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven." And if you look at the literal Greek translations, they also say, "At that time will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven." Now, some of the later translations will change this and say, "And then shall appear in the sky the sign of the Son of Man," or something like that. They'll change it. They'll change the location of the sign to be in, or they'll change the heaven being the location of the sign. But what we're saying here is heaven is the location of the Son of Man, not the location of the sign. So how do we know that? Well, Mark tells us, this is at the very end of the Gospel of Mark, when Jesus gives the Great Commission. He said, and it says, "So then after the Lord has spoken unto them, He was received up into heaven and sat on the right hand of God." So Jesus is in heaven. After he completed His work on earth, He goes to heaven, sits down at the right hand of God. So what will appear at the destruction of Jerusalem is not a sign in heaven of the Son of Man, but instead what will appear is a sign that the Son of Man is in heaven, right? So it's a little bit confusing, but heaven is the location of the Son of Man, not the location of the sign. We know that because we know that Jesus is reigning in heaven. So remember that, just sort of, we can break this down a little bit. Remember that Jesus is the one that pronounced judgment upon Jerusalem. We've got it here in chapter 24. We saw it in chapter 23. Other times we see it, but Jesus is the one that pronounced judgment upon Jerusalem. Jerusalem was destroyed ultimately because of its rejection of Jesus and the fact that they crucified Him, right? Jesus told them in chapter 23 to go ahead and finish what your father started. They finished what their father started by killing the Son of God. So Jerusalem was destroyed because of its lack of belief in Jesus and its rejection of Jesus and its execution of Jesus. So God's judgment upon Jerusalem indicated two things: that Jesus has taken His rightful place in heaven, and that the judgment He has predicted has come. So it's only fitting that the one that pronounced the judgment and the one that was the reason the judgment was brought because he was killed. It's only fitting that when the judgment came, that it would be a sign of the one that predicted the judgment and a sign of the one that whose death led to the judgment ultimately. So the destruction of Jerusalem is a sign of the Son of Man in heaven. It means that Jesus is victorious. He overcame death. He overcame the grave. He fulfilled exactly what He came to this earth to fulfill. He pronounced judgment upon Jerusalem because of their rejection of Him. So it's only fitting that the destruction of Jerusalem itself would be a sign of Him, the one that predicted it, and the one whose death led to the judgment upon Jerusalem to begin with. So the next very difficult portion of here, Matthew 24, 29 through 31, is where Jesus says, they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power. So I've broken up the verses a little bit here, but you see in verse 30, and then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. So how does that not apply to Jesus' second coming? We always hear Jesus coming in the clouds, right? You would think that seeing the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven has to indicate that it's Jesus coming in the second coming. But what's interesting, if you go back again to verse 3, where the disciples are asking Jesus these questions to begin with, and when they say, "What shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world?" notice they use this Greek word parousia, which literally means the future visible return from heaven of Jesus to raise the dead and hold the judgment. So they asked Him, what's going to be the sign of your final return to raise the dead and enter the judgment? Well, in verse 30, Jesus tells them, when they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds, the word He used for coming is a different Greek word. It means to appear or make one's appearance or come before the public. So Jesus didn't respond with the same word that they did. When they asked for what's the sign for your second coming, the word parousia is the Greek word for Jesus' second coming. Jesus didn't respond with the same Greek word. He used another one that just shows that He's coming, but He's not coming in His second coming per se. But if you jump down to verse 38 and 39, so we'll see this as we go on, but at this time, Jesus has transitioned to His second coming. So in verse 35, we see the transition of subjects to His second coming. So in verse 34, He finishes answering the questions about destruction of Jerusalem. Verse 35, He transitions, and beginning in verse 36, Jesus is now answering their questions about His second coming. So when He's talking about His second coming, this is what He says in verse 38. For as in the days that were before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark, and knew not until the flood came and took them all away. So shall also the coming of the Son of Man be. So when Jesus makes the application here that basically His coming is going to be sudden, like the flood was sudden, so shall the coming of the Son of Man be. He uses the same Greek word that the apostles did. So the coming of the Son of Man, the parousia, the future visible return from heaven of Jesus to raise the dead and hold the judgment, is going to come swiftly like the flood came to those in Noah's day. So we can see the difference that Jesus used the same Greek word the apostles did, the disciples did in verse 39, but not in verse 30. So verse 30 is not the coming of Jesus in His parousia or His second coming. Instead, it's His coming in judgment upon the nation of Judah unto the city of Jerusalem because of their rejection of Him and their execution of the Son of God. So we can see a distinction here when we make a significant distinction between His second coming and His coming in verse 29 through 30. So we'll continue looking at verses 29 through 31 next week. We'll look at a little bit more detail. I just wanted to at least introduce it and be able to show us that this is not talking about His second coming. This is still talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. Verses 29 through 31 is talking about His judgment coming upon the destruction of Jerusalem. So Jesus' coming is not going to be a physical coming. We could say it's not going to be a physical coming like His actual second coming will be. But instead, it's going to be His coming in judgment that was executed on Jerusalem in AD 70. So anybody got any questions or comments about our study this morning? This is a lot of information. Every week seems like we got a lot of information, but it's a deep study. It's a rich study. It's been helpful for me. I hope it's been helpful for everybody else. So anybody got any questions or comments before we close out this morning? All right. Thank you all.